smoking section with Stephen Helfer, representing that portion of the population who enjoys tobacco, and standing up for people who don't think they should be ostracized and alienated and taxed, discriminated against, etc., etc. And my good friend Roger Nicholson contacted me on Facebook, and he took umbrage, I think, at being described as a self-loathing smoker. So I want to apologize to Roger, because if he doesn't, he's certainly not a self-loathing person. I guess what I mean is that people who really are conflicted because they smoke and yet they're inundated with anti-smoking propaganda, so they kind of internalize this idea that somehow they are doing something that is antisocial, when really nothing could be farther from the truth. And tobacco for 8,000 years has been an extremely social plant, a substance, and of course, as I've mentioned many times on the program, something that Native Americans held in reverence, and was particularly useful in promoting peace and discussions of peace and whatnot. And I think even today, when people sit down and have a few cigarettes and maybe a few drinks, or maybe a few cigars, they feel just a bit more peaceful than they would otherwise. And I think this is the big attraction for tobacco. It does not intoxicate, and it promotes intellectual activity, relaxation, socialization, and all of these things. And I think that's the reason people smoke. And I don't think they smoke simply because they've been hoodwinked by tobacco companies. If you look historically at the United States, there was plenty of tobacco around way before you had modern cigarette makers. And even people were, particularly in Mexico, which of course is not the United States, I looked at Ulysses S. Grant's memoirs, and he was astounded because when he was in Mexico, the number of people who smoked cigarettes. At that time, cigarettes were much less common in the United States, and most people smoked cigars and pipes, or they chewed tobacco. And so this kind of idea that somehow through modern advertising and through product placement in movies, the American population has been hoodwinked into something does not stand up under scrutiny. I mean, even if you go into the polar north, the Inuit all smoked. The men did, the women didn't, and they were not subjected to some kind of advertising blitz. So, but at the same time, I don't want Roger to feel bad, because I know he's a very sensitive person, and I enjoy hearing from him on Facebook, being messaged on Facebook, and maybe one of these days he'll be able to give us a call on the program. Speaking of which, why don't I just put up the phone number and see if I can get some interesting calls tonight. I know we get a call from Jim from time to time, and from a few other people. And one of the members of Cambridge Citizens for Smokers' Rights, who's very interested in the 12-step program and how coffee and cigarettes associated with the 12-step program helps people get off of intoxicating drugs. Drugs that can get you into trouble with the law, can make you crash your car, not be able to go to work the next morning, lose your temper with your spouse, and these are things that tobacco and caffeine never do. And so when we talk about addiction, it's very important because the term is so overused to describe so many different kinds of behavior, even thought patterns, etc. It's important that we understand that real addiction and the classical definition of addiction prior to about the 1980s really applied mostly, if not exclusively, to those drugs that that intoxicated you, that impaired your judgment, interfered with your ability to drive a car or even walk, and that when they could become so habit-forming that withdrawal symptoms were writhing on the floor, even in the case of alcohol, sometimes dying. These are things that just have nothing to do with tobacco or coffee or tea, these things. So in this particular forum that is on recovery, I thought it was interesting how one of the respondents had what I thought was a very intelligent observation, and she said, "I don't eat after I smoke a cigarette, which is what I did after I smoked pot. My motor skills are not impaired." Neither of those things. In fact, motor skills are improved with tobacco, and one's appetite is reduced with tobacco. So instead of getting the munchies, you can step away from those last few bites, which either can make your stomach feel overfull, or if repeated day after day, week after week, can cause obesity. I don't have to worry about how I'm going to drive home when I drink coffee. I don't black out. I don't say things to people I regret. I don't act any crazier than I do without coffee. And I don't miss work or throw up for hours the morning after I drink coffee. So again, the point that she's making is, yes, you might be addicted to coffee, whatever that means. It's difficult to stop. You feel a little bit irritable if you don't drink it. But it does not affect you. It does not intoxicate you. And that is a crucial thing. And that prior, as I said before, at one time the original definition of addiction was something, you could only be addicted to something which intoxicated you. But with the medicalization of society in general, now we use that word to refer to all sorts of things that are habit forming, like gambling, for example, which can be habit forming, but again, doesn't intoxicate you. And you can certainly drive home after you gamble, play Texas Hold'em at Mohegan Sun after a whole day of that. Now, I think I'm going to see if I can pull up what I call my Smoker of the Week, and let's see if we can find our Smoker of the Week. That should not be too difficult, but we'll give it a try. Let's see, I think I see it. Here we go. And, I guess she's not the most youthful looking of people, but then again, when you get into your 80s, mid-80s and so forth, I don't think anyone looks all that spry. But this is a woman who's married to someone very, very famous. She herself was probably not quite as famous. She was married to a man named Sakharov, who was a Nobel Peace Prize recipient, and I assume a big promoter of democratic reform in the Soviet Union. And this is Dr. Elena Bonner. And she too was a reformer, democratic reformer during the Cold War. And she died in 1911 at the age of 88, which it seems to me to be a reasonably long period of time to live, particularly when we are told that if you smoke, you're going to shorten your lifespan incredibly. So 88 years is pretty long. According to the Globe obituary in 2011, friends and family spoke of Dr. Bonner as a vibrant, intelligent woman who loved reading and writing poetry, spending time with her grandchildren, and chain smoking acrid Russian cigarettes. So from our file of exceptional smokers, that is, smokers who distinguish themselves in some particular way, Dr. Elena Bonner, who lived to be 88. Now we'll get back to me, and here we are. There we are. Back to me again, and we'll turn on the phone and see what happens with that in that realm. And there was, it seems that British newspapers, particularly the Telegraph, carry more, I guess they're not quite as stuffy as the New York Times or the Boston Globe, but they carry some, let's say, contrarian viewpoints, and often we will find stories of smokers who are in their late 90s or even their hundreds, which we like to document as anecdotes that contradict the anti-smoking hypothesis or thesis. And in one of these papers, the Telegraph, a very interesting article by a doctor by the name of Michael Fitzpatrick, who was very disturbed because he felt that anti-smoking campaigners were really messing with facts when they celebrated the 10th anniversary, which was this year, of the kind of smoking ban in bars and restaurants in Great Britain. And he is not celebrating, he says, and he says it's for several reasons, one of which is that he cited the testimony of Dr. Richard Dahl, and Dr. Richard Dahl was the first researcher who documented a statistical relationship between smoking and lung cancer, a correlation. Of course, one of the rules of statistics is that a correlation does not mean a causation. It could, maybe there was a greater, like maybe more people who smoke cigarettes engaged in other behaviors, but simply Dahl was the first person. And in 2004, when asked a question about secondhand smoke, he not only said that the evidence against secondhand smoke was weak, but he said it was very weak. Looking at even the statistical evidence, even the correlation, it is very, very hard to make the argument that there is a causation between secondhand smoke and illness. It's even hard to make a statistical correlation, and this is coming from Sir Richard Dahl, who is probably the most famous epidemiologist who has ever lived, perhaps. And as a guest on another television show, when queried again about secondhand smoke or passive smoking, he said to the hostess of the show, quote, "The effects of other people smoking in my presence are so small that it doesn't worry me," end of quote. And then this particular doctor who wrote this column, another thing he was talking about is that, for example, after they introduced the bans in 2007, or the ban, heart disease declined in Great Britain. And they say, well, this is because of the introduction of the ban, but this is kind of what this particular doctor, Dr. Michael Fitzpatrick, calls a sleight of hand, an epidemiological sleight of hand, because even prior to the bans, heart disease, deaths from heart disease were declining before 2007. So the proponents of these smoking bans are trying to claim that there is some kind of causal or even correlative relationship between the ban and the decline in heart disease, but the decline in heart disease was going on way before the ban. As a matter of fact, the decline of heart disease both in the United States and Great Britain has been going on since the 60s, and a lot of it has to do with better treatment for people with heart attacks, some change of diet, people are more conscious of exercising. So way before there were smoking bans and way before even there was a large decline in rates of smoking, already deaths from heart disease were declining. So it's really a kind of sleight of hand to say, oh, well, because we introduced a ban or because smoking rates are declining, heart disease is declining. And then this doctor again, this Michael Fitzpatrick, I guess he really does not like government coercion that much, and he talked about how he went into his office, his clinic, and there were signs up one day, all of a sudden, no smoking. But as he pointed out in this column, no one had smoked in the waiting room for 10 years as far as anyone could remember. So why put up the sign? Well, you put up the sign just to hector and hector people to feel that they are they shouldn't even think about smoking. And certainly I don't think thinking about smoking causes any problems to innocent bystanders. And he closes the column with something that I think is really good. He goes, this is a quote from it, "There is something insidious in the way the anti-smoking campaign has increasingly curtailed the autonomy of the individual in making decisions related to health." Now that is certainly a well-constructed sentence and really gets it on the, hits it on the nose. So for example, it reminds me of Alexis de Tocqueville when he warned about some of the problems democratic countries could face. And one of those was when the government passes laws about small things. You know, a lot of people say, well, I have my freedom of speech, I have my right to vote. Those are the important things. And certainly they are very, very important. But when you do something like say, well, you can't smoke in your bar anymore, that is something that affects everybody on a daily basis. There are not that many people really who exercise their right of free speech that often. I mean, of course we do, but it's not something, it's not like we can't go down to our neighborhood bar anymore and enjoy a cigarette, which affects us very much in our day-to-day behavior. After all, we don't vote, but probably every 4 years or every 2 years here in Cambridge. But like having a cigarette after dinner in a restaurant is something that really hits so many people. And so de Tocqueville talked about how tyranny in small ways, because it affects so many people, so often is sometimes worse than tyranny in big ways. So, I mean, even in communist China, even in East Germany, at least you could enjoy a cigarette without the government telling you, oh, smoking is verboten. You can't smoke in a bar, and you can't smoke in a restaurant, and you can't smoke even, you know, as we're seeing now, they're telling people you can't smoke in your own home, or you can't smoke on a beach, or you can't smoke in a public park. Fortunately, in Cambridge, the City Council has gone easy on the parks in large extent because the City of Cambridge is very cognizant that a lot of poor people and smoke, and their access and their for them to enjoy a public park, it would be very different if they were forbidden to smoke in it. And so my hat is off in that regard to the City Council of Cambridge. Now, Audrey Silk, who is a very active smokers' rights campaigner from New York City and has a very active Facebook page, put up a very interesting article, or not an article, was just talking about a study that's being done to determine how much pleasure people get from smoking, because there is some congressional, I believe, mandate on federal agencies that when they pass a regulation and when they figure the costs versus the benefits, they also have to determine, well, will this deprive people of certain pleasure? And it's an interesting concept, but of course the anti-smoking campaigners don't want to say that, well, anybody can enjoy smoking, which is sort of crazy, especially if you look at how so many men in particular really enjoy cigars, how so many men at least used to enjoy pipes, and how many people, as my good friend Paul Neff often points out, continue to smoke cigarettes even in the face of such stigmatization and taxation. And but of course that is very difficult to determine, because I think, and this is what I brought up when I was talking about Roger Nicholson in the beginning, whom I will no longer describe as a self-loathing smoker, that a lot of people don't acknowledge the kind of pleasure they get from a cigarette and simply think that they're addicted. Now, a cigarette with a cup of coffee in the morning, or a cigarette with a drink, or a cigarette with a crossword puzzle, or a cigarette after a big meal, there is a tremendous amount of pleasure there. You know, not the kind of pleasure that one gets, let's say, from owning an estate on Martha's Vineyard, but a kind of pleasure that is very accessible to anyone, no matter what their income and no matter what their general state of being is. Like, I know sometimes when I've been very, very depressed, I can, you know, and it's been very difficult for me to derive pleasure from anything, I still can, you know, enjoy a cigarette, particularly at these times after a meal. So this is something that has been mandated to agencies, and this is something that fortunately we do have in our public policy making, which I think is a very good thing. But of course, what I think Audrey was concerned about is some of these surveys that are done. Do respondents to the surveys have a tendency to answer the questions the way they think the surveyor wants them to? Oh, I really don't get any pleasure from smoking. It's just a terrible addiction. I wish I had never started. I know it's certain death. Of course, everything is certain death. It's one of the things we are all certain of, be you a smoker or a non-smoker. So, hats off to Audrey Silk for her work. Thanks for watching the smoking section. Good night.